Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today I wanted to talk about when you're in circumstances where you make people angry. I refer to myself as being unauthoritarian, and I used to refer to myself as being libertarian, but libertarian as a term has been hijacked in this country, ironically, by authoritarian people on the right. But, those kind of ironies wear a little thin. So I've now started referring to myself as unauthoritarian. And being unauthoritarian primarily means that you have to question authority in every circumstance. And there are ways in which you can do this. It doesn't always have to be kicking the butt. Yet, in some regard, I find myself having to not necessarily satirize, but in some circumstances just play the devil's advocate in order to illustrate how ridiculous certain positions are. I've changed my views with regards to the International Society of Artificial Life, and I've done this in large part because the Society has a new president. And I feel quite strongly that I can work with the president, and although he's not 100% like-minded with a lot of my views, he's sufficiently interested and just generally accommodating to be considerably more supportive and sympathetic than, what has historically been the International Society for Artificial Life. And in this regard, I had some concerns. I asked some questions today in a particular board meeting, which is handled over Skype. And one of the things that came through this meeting was that a number of the participants didn't understand what network latency meant, in terms of the fact that when there's a stop, people can start talking at the same time because they don't hear the other person. It doesn't necessarily mean they're interrupting. It's just a function of Skype. And through this introduction, I guess because I was the provocateur, perhaps, associated with certain aspects of the society, people took exception to this interaction. But my perspective is I'd been quiet for a good 20 minutes. I hadn't said anything even close to my piece. I'd watched the general handover and passing of information, general normative fashion, even though it was actively working against the benefit of the society, and I had to put it into a certain degree of context. I generally try to say the minimum possible amount that I need to say. I don't often explain things in great detail because I don't think that that's necessary in these circumstances, and quite frankly, every interaction that I have typically is, not necessarily designed to cause pain, but designed to at least get people to think. And I don't want to give a monologue in these circumstances. I just want to point out where things are really a little bit curious and when it looks almost like we're operating with the mafia. And there are many levels to this, many ways of describing it, but I've reflected, firstly, do I care that I come off as such an arsehole, for want of a better term? I don't really care. I think what's more important here is if there is an agreed upon set of rules, that probably indicates that there's something going really terribly wrong. And if you don't bring those rules into question, if you don't ask what the motivation of those rules are, and if you don't actually get a reasonable answer through that, you're doing an important function. You're actually discarding the emperor's new clothes, pointing out the dude's nude, and just moving on from that. So I don't feel a moral burden associated with interacting with these authoritarian groups. I do feel in some regard that it would be nice to be respected or liked or, not challenged in such a violent and vicious way in some circumstances. But do I really care? No, I don't care. My interest is tertiary from what the interests are of the certain individuals I was dealing with. And in that light, I think it's far more important to prompt the society in a particular direction. Truth be told, I've had the same experience associated with a local community action group, with the view there that many assumptions are not explicitly stated and have to be discovered through a few iterations. But my role is to question these assumptions. My role is to prompt a certain degree of discourse, and actually, as was the case for the International Society today, also have an ability to see who really stands with you and who really stands against you. And in this light, thankfully, I always find the people that stand against me to be just a little bit curious and to be a little bit invested in particular things to the point where it's almost a conflict of interest. In fact, in almost all these cases where I instigate these kind of things, it is due to a genuine conflict of interest, which I don't have to explicitly state. I can just allow to come out through posing a certain number of questions, a certain series of different perspectives. My hope through this ultimately, on some level, although it's rarely the case, is that I might get some existential respect at the end of it. If I don't get some existential respect, I walk away. But in some regard, it always takes a little bit of energy. It's always a little bit niggling. I often question what my role is as someone who is fundamentally unauthoritarian with authoritarian groups. I guess it's to promote change, and ideally and hopefully move towards something that is slightly less disturbing than the way things are currently. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.